My talk is just an introduction on what my specialty is. So what oculoplasty is. Now, I get this question very often, as in what oculoplasty is. 25 years ago, one ophthalmologist used to treat every disease of the eye. Now, as you can see, there are 5 ophthalmologists treating one eye. Soon there will be so much specialization, you will have a right eye specialist and a left eye specialist. But till then, our level of specialty is such that we have demarcated our areas, and oculoplasty basically is, in a nutshell, the art and science of beautiful eyes. It includes everything related to the eyelids, tumors of the eye, lacrimal disorders, trauma, the orbit, the bony socket, and cosmetic procedures like Botox, fillers, and facial aesthetic surgery. So I'm just going to touch over each of these and show you photographs, clinical cases of patients whom we see. So when we talk about eyelid diseases, the most common that we encounter is ptosis. And ptosis is basically drooping of any one eye or both eyes. So this is the most commonest thing. We almost encounter this at least 4 or 5 patients every week. Now this is something that can be corrected very well, easily, without a scar, such that they retain the height and the contour of the normal eye. Now you can see here the right eye the left eye here has been operated, and you can barely appreciate a scar. Similar is the case in the right eye of this young lady. Now sometimes it's very important in children to identify and operate this early, because children, if they don't get operated early, the ptosis, the drooping, covers the eye completely, and that eye becomes amblyopic, or it becomes a lazy eye, and that's very important. Some unusual things that we see is sometimes there is a associated jaw winking phenomenon with ptosis. Then another common thing that we see congenitally is entropion, where you can see the lashes of this baby are completely turned inward and they are rubbing on the eye. Again, surgically they can be corrected with minimal scarring. Similarly, in the older age group, we have senile entropion, where the eyelashes are rubbing the eye because the eyelid turns inwards. This also can be corrected surgically to give good results. Now, lacrimal disorders is associated with watering of the eye. Now, this is basically can be seen congenitally. That is the most common thing. We have children, babies less than 1 year of age, whose eyes are watering. We commonly ask them to, massage over the eyelids, over the lacrimal sac to relieve that. But any obstruction at any level in the entire drainage system can cause watering that needs to be corrected surgically. And if left untreated, they can develop a big abscess or a acute dacryocystitis like this, which then needs to be treated initially with antibiotics and subsequently with surgery to reduce that. Now, another less known aspect about oculoplastics is ocular oncology. Now, you'd ask me that how common are tumors of the eye? Well, they are pretty common, and when we talk about ocular oncology, we're talking about everything, not just tumors within the eye, but the eyelid, the conjunctiva, the surface, intraocular tumors, as well as tumors within the orbit or orbital tumors. So intraocular tumors, of course, are less amenable to be treated in a private setting. We need an institute where we can treat them, or a big hospital, because they need a multimodal treatment of radiation, chemotherapy. But just so that we are aware that retinoblastoma is very common, and the most common way we pick it up is by seeing the yellow reflex in the eye when we click a photograph with a flash, and or unexplained squint, unexplained bleeding within the eye, or if there is a family history of one sibling who has it. Similarly, in adults, uveal melanoma is a common intraocular tumor. Other surface tumors that we can pick up commonly is people complain with a white dot or a red dot in the eye, and most commonly they are very benign, but they can be squamous cell carcinomas like these. These are all different variants of ocular surface squamous cell carcinoma, particularly seen in the immunocompromised patients who are HIV positive, because the HPV virus also has a predilection to cause squamous cell carcinoma of the conjunctiva. Apart from ocular cell squamous carcinoma, even melanocytic or pigmented tumors can occur in the conjunctiva, and there's a whole big variety of them. They can be primary acquired melanosis, nevus, epithelioid nevus and melanomas, melanocytosis. Each of them are different conditions, and each of them need to be identified and treated. So it's not just one simple conjunctival tumors can be quite complex with a variety of presentations. Sometimes something as minor as a trauma in the eyelid, if not attended to, can develop into what is called a pyogenic granuloma, which can otherwise look quite worrisome, but can be treated very well without leaving any scar behind. Now similarly, when we come from the conjunctival surface to the eyelid, especially in the older age group, there are a lot of eyelid tumors that are seen, like basal cell carcinomas, which can be locally aggressive. They don't metastasize to different parts of the body, but they can burrow in and affect the bone, affecting different sites. The canthus, that is at the angle of the eye, the tumors affecting the angle of the eye have a high predilection for intracranial extension. So you should be very aware of picking these tumors up. Eyelid tumors can be excised and the eyelid can be reconstructed. Pigmented tumors, again, melanomas have a high rate of metastatic spread. So we should be a little careful with these. Then coming to tumors behind the eye, that is within the orbit. Now they can be proptosis or outward protrusion of the eye is the most common way these patients will present. Now this lady, of course, is an extreme case who presented after 6 years of gradual progression of the protrusion of the eye. But with a minimally invasive technique using the eyelid crease, we are able to treat, and her vision, of course, she regained all her lost vision because of the compressive effect. But the joy comes in treating these patients who are happy even with the cosmesis after such a big tumor excision. Similarly, in children, they can, these are congenital tumors that develop at the angle of the eyebrow. These are called dermoid tumors. Here you can see it in the CT scan. Again, without a scar, we can excise them. So the way we make sure that there is no scar is we utilize the eyelid crease to make the incision, and using a tunneling technique, we can go up and excise that tumor. Now, sometimes we get these rare cases of where we see unusual clinical signs. So I just thought, since my talk is post-lunch, I'll have a little unusual video to awaken all of us. So this was a gentleman who said very unique symptoms, that whenever I bend down, my eye seems to come out. And we all wondering, how does that happen? He said, no, whenever I bend down or whenever I'm straining, suppose I'm going to the toilet, I feel that my eye is coming out. Now, we've always read in textbooks that positional proptosis can occur in a condition called orbital varices, but very rarely do we actually end up seeing these patients. So these are vessels within the orbit, varices, like we have varicose veins, dilated veins of the orbit. They get accumulated, the blood gets stagnated within it. And when we are straining or there is increase in intra-abdominal pressure, these veins get engorged. So this is how he looks when he is normal. And when you see him straining, this is how it becomes. So it's the dramatic effect of this was what I was looking at. So of course these patients also can be treated with surgically. With surgery, we first inject intralesional sclerosants to sclerose the varices, and then we can go and operate them. The other part of my specialty is also ocular trauma. Now again, trauma doesn't just mean the eye. It can mean the eyelid, the bony socket around the eye, like this gentleman who came with a trauma that was almost 1 week old. Now what is important is that the canaliculus or the lacrimal drainage, the tear duct, is cut in this patient. So in these patients, we have to go and reconstruct the tear duct such that the patient doesn't end up getting watering after the surgery. And again, we get some extreme cases of trauma. This gentleman who came walking to our clinic with a piece of wood sticking out of his eye. So we were pretty convinced that this eye is completely lost. So we ended up doing a CT scan, and then we could visualize that the eye was actually hidden somewhere within the bony socket, and this wooden piece had pierced the orbit and was lying in very close proximity with the frontal lobe, but thankfully not the brain. We went ahead and removed the piece, and gradually over time, the patient recovered substantially to gain nearly half of the vision in that eye. So this is the pre-op and on the left side, and that's how he became post-surgery. So very gratifying for both the doctors and the patients. Another common cause of trauma in around the eyelid that we see is periocular dog bites. Now, very common. Now, one word of caution is that we all know that dog bite wounds are not to be sutured. The WHO guidelines do mention one exception, and that is the eyelid. Because if the eyelid is not sutured, it can lead to exposure keratopathy and loss of vision. And that is something that should not happen. So, despite conventional wisdom that no dog bite wound should be sutured, the eyelid has to be sutured, because if this pedicle were to be left alone, it would eventually get necrosed at the edge, and loss of tissue of the eyelid makes it very difficult to reconstruct it. And with all prophylactic of local injection of anti-venom, anti-sera, immunoglobulin sera and Rabipur to be the schedule to continue, we can reconstruct the eyelid with very gratifying results. We can barely tell that he had a dog bite. Similarly, a lot of domestic violence and road traffic accident. This lady was attacked by her husband with a axe in a fit of rage. Over time, we have been able to reconstruct, and she now has some semblance of an eyelid back. A lot of patients require socket reconstruction and globe reconstruction. So these are patients who had trauma, when they were a child, and the eye completely shrivels up and becomes a small thing like this. Now the eye doesn't have any vision, but what we can do is give them cosmetic rehabilitation with the help of a prosthetic eye. And today the prosthetic eye, the technology that we have of recreating prosthetic eye is so advanced that we are able to actually recreate even the blood vessels that are appearing on the eye. And at the end of the prosthetic sitting, you won't be able to tell which eye was the affected eye and which eye is the normal eye. Similarly, this lady also had a trauma when she was a child, and we are able to do it. So what we do is, it involves a surgery where we remove the eye, the deformed eye, place an orbital implant within the eye such that the volume is restored, and on top of this implant is where we place the prosthetic shell. Now coming to the orbit, like we mentioned the bony socket, the most commonest thing that we see affecting the orbit is Graves' disease or exophthalmos, proptosis. So patients in some patients they come with just a lot of soft tissue swelling around the eye, and when we do imaging we can see that the extraocular muscles are enlarged. You can see from this angle that the eyes are definitely proptosis before surgery. This is after surgery, when we have taken care of the eyelid bags and also pushed the globe back in. The way we do it is much like how you would try to fit a scoop of ice cream into a cone. So the size of the ice cream scoop will not change because that is the eye. What we can do is widen the cone so that the eye goes back into the socket. This is the classical Graves' ophthalmopathy look with the surprise staring look because of lid retraction and soft tissue enlargement. With a 3-wall decompression, we can actually give them very good results, such that the globe sits back into the orbit. Sometimes the eye doesn't come out, just the eyelid gets retracted. Like in this case, it can even be unilateral or bilateral. Like in these ladies, both of these cases had unilateral retraction of the eyelid. It becomes very embarrassing socially, and a lot of times they don't even seek treatment for it. But as a clinician, we can pick it up and advise them to get their thyroid function test done, and so on and so forth. Now coming to Botox. Now whenever I say Botox, everybody thinks of cosmetic uses. Well, Botox actually has more functional use than cosmetic uses. So a lot of cases of blepharospasm and hemifacial tics and spasms can be treated very effectively with Botox. The only catch is that the duration of action of Botox lasts only for 4 to 5 months. So every 4 to 5 months they would need to get injected. We have patients who have been treated with Botox for almost 12 years now, very religiously. They come every 4 months, get it done. So on a long-term basis, Botox for spasms can be treated. These are patients who have bilateral hemifacial spasms, bilateral blepharospasms, unable to keep their eyes open. And it can be extremely difficult for a patient with blepharospasm to even walk because their eyes are involuntarily shut. With Botox, that completely releases the protractor muscles of the eyelid, and they're able to keep their eyes open and have mobility as well as vision. So earlier you could see, to keep his eyes open, they would have to manually lift their eyelid. And finally, facial aesthetics. We just try to stick to the eyelid. The most common thing that I hear is then, why can't I send it to a plastic surgeon? Well, because the eyelid has a unique anatomy, and this is something that we've been trained to do. And the eyelid is the only part of the eye that we treat. So a specialist can always do a better job than a man who also does all other parts of the body. So for the upper lid, we have a lot of patients who have a lot of overhanging skin. Now this can be in younger patients also who have this condition called blepharochalasis, where they have recurrent episodes of swelling of the upper eyelid, which is associated with this boggy skin that gets collected. Now that can be corrected, and they can have a very normal contour of the eyelid. This is in the younger age group, whereas in the older age group, because of age-related change and gravity, the excess skin around the eyelids can make a fold, and this can overhang and droop on the sides. Now this also can be corrected very well, and like we saw in the patients with ptosis, there is no resulting scar. So it just gives you a very youthful look. And it's not just that old people need this. Now a lot of younger people with their lifestyles and all different changes that they do, irregular sleep habits, they tend to get, and also thyroid eye disease. So this puffiness is something that younger people are very conscious about. So eyelid bags that develop, not just the young people but also older people. So this is a transconjunctival blepharoplasty, different from what the plastic surgeon would do. A plastic surgeon would prefer to do a transcutaneous blepharoplasty, where a scar would be made on the skin and this excess bag of fat would be excised. Now what a oculoplastic surgeon can offer is, because in being an ophthalmologist, they can go through the conjunctiva on the inner side. The net effect is the correction is equally good, but there is no scar. So, and when you're treating a patient who has cosmetic concerns, the last thing you want to give them is a scar. And it's not always surgery. Sometimes these things can also be masked very well with what is now called dermal fillers. These are hyaluronic acid gel injections, the same thing that the same material present in our joints. So she had a concern that these eyelid bags and this crease was very prominent. Now this is called the nasolabial fold, the tear trough deformity. And with that injection of filler, we can smoothen that. It's like placing cement between two tiles. So you just smoothen that so that it becomes seamless, and the effect is that shadow goes away. It can also be done in slightly younger person. Now she had dark circles. In darker skin like Indians with dark circles, fillers can do a fantastic job and mask that completely. So all in all, this is the overview of what my branch is. So there's more to ophthalmology than just cataract, and oculoplasty is a very specialized branch. So a lot of it depends on the clinical acumen, because many patients are themselves not aware of the conditions that they have, which is why the onus on the referring practitioner is very high, to have a high degree of suspicion. And as you can see, it can give us very satisfying results for the doctor, the patient, and everybody around. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, so we do brow lifts that can be done endoscopically. So we make a coronal incision, 3 incisions here. Using an endoscope, we rift the periosteums to give that look. The facelift can be done again through a preoral incision here. In men, especially Indian males, the scar may be visible, but in women, the scar can be hidden very well to give a good correction. But then again, facelifts tend to have a lifespan of shelf life around 8 to 9 years, beyond which it comes back to where it was, because you can't beat gravity, so that pulls it down anyways. Yeah. So that, like we said, there are 2 parts to the whole surgery that we do. So one is the surgery where we remove the eye and place an implant. And we have to give a waiting period of at least 6 weeks between the healing of the conjunctival wound and placing and preparing the prosthesis. So roughly the surgery itself would cost somewhere between 30 to 35,000, and about half that amount, so around 17 to 20,000 for the prosthesis. So I think the entire thing would not be more than 60,000 for a patient. Mind you, the people who make the prostheses are specialists. They are optometrists who are called ocularists, whose only job is to make these prostheses. So that they work in conjunction with oculoplasty surgeons. Yes, ma'am.
It ended up with the iris of two different colors into both the eyes.
Right, ma'am.
So what do you have for that?
So as long as the vision is
No, forget the vision, the cosmetic.
so there are colored contact lenses that can be offered.
That's it?
That's the only
That's
thing.
it?
Well, there are a couple of people who actually do the, I don't know, I think Mitesh might have an idea. There is iris recoloring surgery, but I'm a little skeptical about that. But from a functional point of view, if vision is normal, I would not be too keen on pressing for a surgery.
No, vision is not there at all.
Vision is not there.
Only perception of light.
So then in that case, colored contact lenses can do well, or else if they want absolute identical color, this surgery could be advised, because this is mainly for non-seeing eyes, where we can then recreate. So, yeah, we have good iris colored contact.
Iris implant, they match. We have to take various photographs of the normal eye which we have. I mean, we should color with the paint once. And then there's a German company which will do iris. It's a very expensive stuff which goes inside the eye. It's a very expensive stuff which can have its own complication as well in the form of recurrent uveitis glaucoma. As you said, it's a perception of light. The best thing to go for is simplest, cheapest, and the best
Colored contact.
And with that, we'll move to the next talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Neeta Shanbhag, who's the professor and head of Department of Ophthalmology at D.Y. Patil and an associate at Ayush for many years. She specializes in squint and refractive surgery and has specialized from Sydney Eye Hospital in Australia. And she'll be talking to us on two closely linked topics, that is squint surgery and something very commonly we see, that is the management of red eye.
We'll come back to a very simple topic and probably what is mostly seen by all of you at all stages of your life. And I'm here to simplify it for you so that most of it gets tackled at your end rather than get referred to my end. So, why are we so very much concerned about the red eye? Because the patient finds it offending as everybody mentions it. Okay, most of the times you get phone calls saying my eye is red, and I realized it because so many of my colleagues at office told me it's red. Patient has not realized it, but 10 people have told him it is red, so he wants something to be done about it. Okay. Second thing is, he gives you a phone call because he wants a magic cure. He'll say it's red and I can't see you, but I would like to know what drops to put. So that is magic cure, because unless I have seen it and I prescribe something and it goes away, it's magic, isn't it? Because my clinical acumen is 0 and I have just prescribed him some drops and it's gone away. He finds his family physician who would then prescribe the magic drops if I don't give it to him. Okay? And most of the times his wish comes true till we open the Pandora's box for you, and here it is. Okay? So we have two types of congestions. One is the conjunctival congestion and second is the circumcorneal congestion. When we see a red eye, we have to differentiate between the two because we are here now going into two different levels of diagnosis. Okay, when we talk of conjunctival congestion, the whole eye is red. You have the vessels in an arborizing pattern which extend throughout the eye, right from the fornix up to the cornea. It is bright red in color, and of course the patient is going to have symptoms of redness, pain and watering. On the other hand, you have circumcorneal congestion which will be just around the cornea. The fornices will be clear, and here the patient is going to have redness, pain, watering, and along with that probably a drop in vision. So the main differentiating point between the two would be the color, and second is the vision. If you could differentiate between these two and the pattern and location, in conjunctival congestion you would have it all around the eye. In circumcorneal congestion, as the name suggests, it will be just around the cornea. So one is the pattern, second is the color. Conjunctival would be bright red, the other one would be bluish to dull red, and third is the vision. If the patient tells you my vision is fine, believe me, 9 out of 10 times it will be just conjunctivitis, but if he says his vision is not same, believe me, it is not going to be conjunctivitis and it doesn't get treated at your level. So once the patient says my vision has dropped, there are other methods of investigation which will tell you what is the diagnosis. So we go further. As I've already told you, in conjunctivitis, it will be redness, pain, watering, and a good vision with a miserable patient because the foreign body sensation is so bad. And especially when you can see something, then you complain about other things. If you're not seeing, then you don't complain about the redness, you don't complain about the pain, you don't complain about the watering because you can't see. Then the priority is I can't see. But the minute the patient says it's red, it's hurting me, it's miserable, this, that, but doesn't complain about vision, you know it is conjunctivitis. Okay? Look for lids and ocular adnexia. You'll have some lashes which might be abrading the cornea, which can cause redness. So if you just do a torch examination, you will find that the redness can be because of the eyelashes, which are rubbing against the cornea and the conjunctiva. Here the patient is going to tell you, it's hurting me and it is red, and at the same time, I'm not comfortable with whatever is happening. Some of them will come regularly to you for epilating these eyelashes. There is a permanent cure for it rather than do it every... Okay. They'll come to you every 15 days to a month. Rather than that, there is a permanent cure for everting these eyelashes rather than abrading the cornea. Sometimes they'll come and tell you there's redness at the corner of my eye. There's nothing there, it's just a dermoid. He's not noticed it before, but maybe some inflammation or something which has made it increase in size, and he suddenly notices in front of the mirror and he'll come and tell you, I'm sure it was not there, but it is there since the last 1 week. If we don't know that we are looking at a dermoid, we'll probably go and investigate unnecessarily as to what it is all about, okay? The clue is lack of congestion in the central area of the eye. Most of the times it may be a dermoid, but sometimes you could have a parasitic cyst. So if you have a parasitic cyst, then you have to take the history as to when it started and whether there is waxing and waning in the size of the cyst. If you find that, then it is definitely inflammatory, and here you cannot make a diagnosis unless you have done a USG-B scan or a CT scan, because you would like to know whether the parasitic cyst exists at other places other than where you have seen it. Most of the time the treatment over there is just medical line of treatment, so you spend a lot on investigations and then give him mebendazole, for which he hardly spends anything, and he says, you did so many investigations, doctor, and ultimately just a few medicines and I am better. Okay? The other part is when the patient has a foreign body. He'll come to you with a foreign body. It's nice to use magnification to remove a foreign body, because by the time the patient comes to you, it's already 2 or 3 days. The epithelium has grown over the foreign body. You can't just remove it with the foreign body spud or a swab stick. So with magnification, you can use a fine instrument like a needle or something, which is disposable. Never use an autoclaved one. During our residency days, still all this was hammered into us. We used to have a lot of corneal ulcers because of, some autoclave needle having been used to remove a foreign body. So a disposable needle under magnification, and you can get rid of the foreign body. The result is more inflammation. If the patient tries to remove it by himself, the result would be they would use water to do that, or they would try to use some instrument or some foreign body swab stick to remove the foreign body, and the result would be more inflammation, infection, as the tap water is not even potable, leave alone, put it into your eye. And if there is a defect which gets secondarily infected, you would get a corneal ulcer. So better left to specialists. Sometimes the redness is because of a tear. Some people will come and tell you, I was playing with a pencil or something like that and something went into my eye, but then after that I was fine. This is what it is all about. He was fine for some time till the corneal tear started manifesting with all its problems. Then he gets a red eye. So he says, I must have got conjunctivitis, but actually it's a corneal tear. And here the patient can end up with a loss of vision because of endophthalmitis or a traumatic cataract. So if somebody comes to you with some blunt trauma and says it's just casual, just like look into with a torch and see if there's any other finding into the eye. Sometimes you will get perforations, like you see over here, a perforation which cannot be stitched. It's a round perforation and you cannot stitch it. The minute you take a stitch, you are going to change the axis, you're going to induce a lot of astigmatism. So there are other ways and means of doing it. Don't ignore it. You can still give a good result and a central 6x6 vision if patient comes to you at the right time. Some mild keratitis, either because of infection, trauma, or some inherent endogenous infection, and you will see there is a white spot on the cornea. If it is associated with circumcorneal congestion, then it needs to be referred, because then there are various etiologies for the same. It could not be just trauma or something like that. You would need to look into the history of the patient and probably even investigate further. Corneal ulcers, the minute you see a hypopion, out of your reach, because now the organism is very virulent, no time to lose, you need to treat it very aggressively, and that too with microbiological investigations. Okay? How do we differentiate between different types of corneal ulcers? Little difficult, but if you can see multiple spots, like we call them as satellite lesions, it's usually fungal. And if you see a frank hypopion, it's usually bacterial. That is what we would expect at the level, at the primary level where you look at a patient. But the best diagnosis is only after a microbiological investigation. Viral dendritic ulcers, if you see at the top picture, you can't make out it is a viral ulcer. But when you stain it, the diagnosis is absolutely clear. So, you need special stains plus magnification of a slit lamp to detect. The naked eye cannot see it. And the only thing at our level, when we are first seeing the patient, is to do the corneal sensations. If they are diminished, it is usually viral. Okay? If there is a vision drop, patient says, yesterday I was fine and today I am not fine. I have acute pain and there is a drop in vision. Put a torch and see. If the pupil is dilated and there is corneal edema, it is glaucoma. Okay, now this needs to be referred, because the pressures in the eye, when they should normally be around 17 millimeters, here would be somewhere around 50-60 millimeters of mercury, and the patient can lose vision if not treated on time. All right? Next, you have iridocyclitis. If you can see this difference between the two eyes, you will see that one of the eyes is clear, cornea is having a good luster, pupil is reacting. On the other side, the pupil is not reacting and the cornea is hazy. Okay, if you go on the slit lamp, you will see the findings. The pupil is festoon, meaning the pupil is attached at some places, as a result of which it is not circular in shape. And you can see lot of cells into the anterior chamber, which are those white things. Now, all this is not possible at the naked eye level. It has to be seen on a slit lamp. Last but not the least, endophthalmitis. It could be post-operative, or it could be because of infection somewhere within the body. Some of the patients have HIV, some of the patients have endogenous infections. They are on long-term steroids. They could end up with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. They could have fungal infections within the body. All that can give rise to this even without a surgery. So, if it is post-surgical, you are looking out for infection. If it is not post-surgical, then you have to investigate aggressively to find out what is the cause, because unless you treat the cause, this is not going to go away. All right? So if it is post-surgical, again, conjunctival plus ciliary congestion, a drop in vision, a hypopion seen, corneal clarity lost, and needs treatment immediately. Sometimes patient gets operated, and for follow-up, if the operating doctor is not available, might come to you for a follow-up. So in those cases, if you see something like that, even if the concerned operating surgeon is not available, please refer to somebody else, because there is no time to be lost. Sometimes it is something very simple, a subconjunctival hemorrhage. Now this was a patient of corneal transplant we had operated, and middle of the night he gave me a call and said, my eye is red, my eye is red. I need to see you immediately. Now a corneal transplant is something you don't want to risk. So in the middle of the night he come and showed me, and all it was a subconjunctival hemorrhage because he had high blood pressure. So sometimes a patient of high blood pressure will come to you with red eyes only because there is a subconjunctival hemorrhage. And when you see that a patient has chronic red eyes, most of the times, of course, drinking is a habit which gives you red eyes, but otherwise it is better to check the blood pressure. I had a patient who used to regularly come to me, and the first question I would ask him, what is your routine blood pressure? He would say, it's 140/80, doctor, it's never high. Then on the third visit when he said, but your treatment is not working on me, so what's wrong? I mean, are you sure you're treating me right? I said, wait, now today I need to take your blood pressure. And he was 240/120. So it is possible that the patient gives you some finding which is not true. So always go back and check, and you will know where you are going wrong, okay? Some you have drug allergies. This is a patient of Stevens-Johnson syndrome. The minute you see these patients, please refer to consultants. There is no time to be lost. Today we have measures whereby you can prevent the detrimental effects of Stevens-Johnson, where people used to lose eyesight. Today we can save them, and we can make them as comfortable as possible with amniotic membrane transplants and stem cell transplants, which are required, apart from the routine steroid therapy which is required to suppress the inflammation. Okay? Again, as Akshay told you about thyroid eye disease, when you see a red eye, it could just be sometimes hypothyroidism. So even if you don't have a lid retraction, you may have a red eye. And if that red eye exists, it means that we have to look into other systemic factors too. So you could be dealing with thyroid eye disease in case of a red eye. You have patients of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis who have red eye, band keratopathies and repeated grafts done. So as I told you, the Pandora's box is unlimited. A red eye is not something which is just conjunctivitis. There are many, many more things to it. And for anything to be diagnosed beyond a conjunctivitis, it has to be seen on specialized equipments. So the minute your patient doesn't get better in a few days, it is better to refer and check out what it is and get the diagnosis. You have chemical burns. Today I am showing you the picture of a patient on the left who's come to me with chronic chemical burns, and this is what we have treated. After multiple amniotic membrane transplants, stem cell transplants, and a final keratoplasty, we managed to deliver 6/18 vision, that is 4 lines of vision. So everything is possible. So if you see something like that, please refer, because today we can really deliver good things to the patient, okay? Thank you very much. I think I'll continue with my second talk on management of squint, which is little varied from what I talked just now on. But since that is the branch that I specialize at Ayush Eye Clinic, I would like to highlight that branch. I would like to thank Dr. Neeta Shah for giving me this opportunity to manage squints in her clinic, because though she knows how to do them, she has appointed me to do them for her. So I would really go in for a round of applause for her for being so kind to her juniors. There's nothing that she can't do, but she has segregated her branches so that everybody gets to do a piece of work in her clinic. Okay, now we are dealing with dilemmas and myths of a patient and the relatives. Some of the dilemmas are that the patient comes to you at a time period and says, I was told it is not correctable. Yeah, slightly. I was told this is not correctable. You know, he comes at marriageable age to me and they say that we went to a doctor when she was small, but they told us it cannot be corrected. So that is why we never bothered to do anything about it. But now she's into the market for marriage and nobody is willing to get married to a girl with a squint. So do something about it. Now what couldn't be done at the age of 6? Can it be done at the age of 21? But it is expected at the age of 21, but not expected at the age of 6. Because the need is at the age of 21. Nobody is bothered about the vision of the child, okay? Some of them will say, in our community is considered to be lucky, so we don't operate. I have heard all these things, that's why I'm telling you. So let the child grow up and it will settle down. Some of the consultants will tell them that. How will it settle down? I don't know. Some of them will tell, the child is too small, don't bother now, let him grow up, then we'll see what is to be done. In the meantime, every 6 months you come and show me, I will see whether it is progressing or no. Every 6 months, if you don't know right now what is to be done, what you're going to tell after 6 months, I don't know. And some of them will say, don't bother, as it may worsen his eye status. So just be happy with what you have. She can say no, so don't bother. So these are some of the myths I would like to correct, because it is causing damage to the child with these statements that we make. A patient walks into our clinic, whether we are general practitioners, family physicians, ophthalmologists, orthopedic surgeons, the trust that he places in us, he expects us to tell whether this is correctable or no. By us, by somebody else is not the concern. So if we can give them the correct advice, I think half the job would be done. Why we possibly need to refer? It is that squint is purely due to a refractive error. Sometimes you just have one eye which is 6/6, other eye which is -14. Now the eye with -14 will have a squint. Now if you give these previous advices which I told you, that -14 is never going to get corrected and that eye is going to go amblyopic, means that the eye is going to lose vision. But if we refer to somebody and he detects it is minus 14 and corrects it, probably the squint gets corrected as well as the vision gets corrected. So the first thing to do when you see a squint is to send the child for a refractive error correction, because some of these squints get corrected only by refractive error corrections. So correct the refractive error and poof, the squint disappears. So again, there is some magic factor in it. It sometimes need to be corrected early to prevent loss of vision. If we have a squint which is present only in one eye and it is not alternating, that means that eye vision will go down because that eye is not fixing at all. I am fixing with only one eye and the other eye is out. So if the other eye is not going to see at all, a certain point or time will come when the brain will say this eye is not seeing, so it refuses to see even when you correct it. So we need to correct the squint to preserve vision in that eye, to correct a vision which exists as a refractive error, and to give binocular vision to the patient. So squint under all standards needs to be corrected. Okay? Correct the squint and the suppression or eccentric fixation gets corrected. So under all categories, if you see a squint, refer to a physician and tell the parent this is a correctable abnormality and we will refer you to a person who can do that for you. First go and get your vision corrected and then we will see what to do from here. Don't tell them this is not correctable because the episode ends over there. He trusts you so much that he doesn't go to somebody else to ask for it. So our job here is to tell them there is something available. First get your vision corrected. We will see whether that available modality can be given to you and we will decide whom we send it to. Okay? Now what are the aims of treatment? Make the eye straight, orthophoric in the primary position. Make vision equal in both the eyes. And try and give stereoscopic vision to the patient. We may not be able to achieve all three endpoints, but we should try. We should try to give one by one whatever is written over there in that sequence. So first you make the eyes straight. Once they are straight, try to equate the vision. And once that happens, try to give them stereoscopic vision. When you equate the eyes and make them straight with good vision in both the eyes, you're giving them flat vision which is two-dimensional. The minute you talk of stereoscopic vision, it is three-dimensional vision. And we all know the benefits of three-dimensional vision. All this will come to you only if you treat the squint less than 6 years of age. Stereoscopic vision cannot be attained after 6 years of age. Okay, so earlier the squint you correct, the third modality can be corrected easily. Later you correct, you can only correct the first and the second. So as a responsibility towards our patient, we should see that the patient gets corrected before 6 years of age. Of course, if you have alternative fixation and all those things, after some years also, till 12, 13 also, you will get binocular vision. But most of the times you will lose binocular vision if you don't treat before 6 years of age. Okay? That doesn't mean if somebody walks into your clinic at 21, the first thing you tell him is now you can't get binocular vision. We know you can't get binocular vision, so we don't highlight it then. But if somebody comes to us below 6 years of age, you highlight it so that they go in for early treatment. We should not highlight things which we cannot treat. We should only highlight things which we can treat. So if somebody comes to you later on, tell them only 2 things can be corrected. Don't tell them third thing cannot be corrected. But if it comes before 6 years of age, emphasize that you have to do it now because otherwise stereoscopic vision will not be there. Okay? So what is the primary doctor's role? Get an eye referral, spectacle number correction, wear glasses for 3 months, review if the squint has decreased or it is the same. If it has not resolved, operate as early as possible to give maximum chances of getting binocular vision. Now here are a few cases. I don't want to go into the details of how it is done and how it is diagnosed. I'm just giving you a few cases which we have done where the preoperative the patient looked like this and after surgery how he has looked. So here you can see that the eye is out. So obviously it is exotropia, and after the surgery you can see that primarily the patient's eyes are straight. Another child, before and after, fully corrected. Now what I meant by alternating, when you fix with one eye, now you can see the left eye fixing, the right eye squinting. When the right eye is fixing, the left eye is squinting. These are some of the cases which will have a little wider range for binocular vision even after 6 years of age, because they are been fixing at both points. But if you have uniocular squint, then binocularity will not be attained after 6 years of age. Here you can see before surgery, esotropia corrected after surgery. Okay? Here the eye is in, there it was out, but both the things you can see that they are orthophoric or they are straight in the primary position. Now, it is not just the horizontal muscles which get affected, sometimes the vertical muscles also get affected. Now, the vertical muscles get affected means the patient tries to tilt, because if we have a division of vision, like if you have two images in the horizontal, you can still manage to fuse over a large area, but if you have vertical, then you can't fuse, and if you can't fuse, you're going to tilt to make it equal. So whenever you see a patient with a tilt, it means he has a vertical component for squint. So you can see this patient, he has a vertical component for squint. And you can see that one of the eyes is overacting, and you can see the muscle in the left upper region overacting, as a result of which this has a vertical component along with the horizontal component, and post surgery you can see he's straight. So we can treat horizontal components as well as vertical components. It is not impossible to treat any type of squint, okay? Another lady who has got horizontal as well as vertical component, pre-surgery, post-surgery. Sometimes you will see that it is a very variable squint. One eye is up, one eye is out. Extremely difficult. Some people told this child, nothing can be done. We treated him, he is absolutely straight. Everything can be done, and everything can be done very nicely, especially in children who are less than 6 years of age. This is a patient who had minus 26 diopters in the left eye, and the right eye was somewhere around minus 4. When you have something like minus 26 diopters, the eye is amblyopic. So this patient, we will only do cosmetic correction. And with cosmetic correction, we will even tell the patient that probably the eye will go out if the visual recovery is not maintained. Okay, so when you're doing cosmetic correction, there is always a possibility that there is a recurrence of squint. But when the vision is equal in both eyes, there is very less possibility that it will recur. So visual rehabilitation is a must to maintain the eyes in the primary position. All right? Now you see over here, the patient is trying to look up. In the left eye, the patient is unable to look up. So here, two vertical muscles are affected, and we have managed to correct the patient. So whether it is a horizontal component or whether it's a vertical component, all squints are treatable. Maybe we will not be able to achieve 100%. Maybe we surgeries. Maybe we will have to do it in 2 sittings. But end result we can deliver. 90% of the times the patient is fully satisfied. 90% of the times the patient's vision can be corrected. So it's my earnest request that if you have a patient who has squint, please refer. You can actually improve the behavior of the child, the scholastic backwardness of the child, and the social acceptance of the child. So as social ambassadors, I would say you will play a great role in doing it. And thank you very much for your patient listening.
Our next speaker is Dr. Neeta Shah, the backbone of Ayush Eye Clinic, the driving force, who will be talking to us on recent advances of cataract and refractive surgery. Just one thing that I'd like to mention now, I'm sure all of you all know when the elder generation trained in ophthalmology, there was only one intracapsular or extracapsular. So ophthalmology itself is a branch that rapidly changes. What was 5 years ago in vogue is today obsolete. So it takes a lot of effort on part of practicing ophthalmologists to keep to date with what is current, and not just to keep themselves knowledge-wise ahead, but also to invest and build a practice that is serving the patients and doing justice to them. And Dr. Neeta Shah does that completely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind words, and thank you very much for coming here on a summer afternoon. And I really don't mind if you all go to sleep. I think I'll be very soothing if you are able to sleep through my talk. So this is how a normal eye works. It functions like a camera. The image of the object passes through the cornea and the lens to fall on the retina. The image falling on the retina is conveyed to the brain through the optic nerve. So whatever we need to do to correct the refractive error, we either do it at the corneal level or at the level of the lens, or we can maybe put something in between. Perfect vision is where you can see the good-looking lady in the front and the gentleman behind simultaneously without any external device. In case of short-sightedness or myopia, only the lady is visible, the gentleman is blurred. In case of a plus power, the lady becomes blurred and the gentleman is seen clearly. And if you have a cylindrical power, that is astigmatism, both of them are seen hazily. These are the situations that we encounter in young people who come and say, I don't want glasses and I cannot tolerate contact lens. So what do we offer them? We can offer them laser vision correction, intrastromal corneal implants, implantable phakic contact lens, and cataract refractive surgeries. Refractive laser surgery may be a photorefractive keratectomy, a laser-assisted in situ keratomileusis, LASIK extra, which is done along with collagen cross-linkage, where a laser correction is done in thin corneas, where LASIK itself is not permitted because it's too thin, femto-LASIK. So we have our analytical tools which help us to select who we can do and what procedure we can do, and the gold standard for that is the Pentacam, which images the entire anterior segment, and it records the measuring of the anterior and posterior corneal elevation and the thickness with Scheimpflug technology. Pachymetry, that is a measure of the corneal thickness, is essential prior to a laser procedure for ensuring sufficient corneal thickness to prevent abnormal bulging of the cornea, which is a side effect known as ectasia, which we see pretty often. Topography is a process of mapping of the curvature of the cornea, and it produces a detailed description of the shape and power of the cornea to determine the visual ability of the individual. So these assessments are mandatory before the patient is taken into the operation theater, so we are not left with surprises or problems which the patient has to live for lifelong. Once they clear this test, we can go ahead, and we are very sure that what we are doing is pretty safe. In case of a thin cornea, what is done is a PRK, where the treatment is on the surface, only 50 millimicron is removed. 50 microns is removed, and because of that, it is biomedically very stable. There are instances of haze and pain. There is a slightly longer recovery period, and if it is done in very high powers, there is known regression, but it does have advantages in patients where a laser vision correction with the LASIK is not indicated. LASIK surgery is the most successfully performed procedure in the world today. It's a pain-free recovery. It's a quick restoration of the eyesight. The disadvantages of the procedure are dryness of eyes, and in some rare instances, halos, decrease in contrast sensitivity, or sometimes a very thick corneal flap. What we do is, a flap is created, the laser beam is applied, and the flap is repositioned. That is what LASIK surgery is. There are certain critical elements of LASIK surgery, and we need to have a combination of all the best elements to avail better visual outcomes. So we need Morion microkeratomes to take the flap. We have an excellent German laser, the EX500, and we need to be very skilled and educate ourselves to do the surgery properly. The EX500 that we have is the fastest laser, lesser laser exposure because of that, and therefore causing less dryness of eyes. And if you see the bottom picture, soon you will see that when the patient moves the eye, what happens is that the laser beam stops till it comes back. So there is an excellent trafficking device which makes it very safe. This leads to larger accuracy and effectiveness of the surgical procedure for the patient. The result of this superior technology is, as you can see the picture at the top part, you can see now how it becomes more clearer. It's like seeing a normal TV and an HD TV. In case of night vision, you can see some slight halos around the lights here. And if it is done with the correct technology, the night vision is enhanced. There are various treatment capabilities that are there in special cases where it is linked along with the laser machine, with the Vario, the oculizer, or the analyzer in special abnormalities that are there in the cornea. The standard range of treatment, which is US FDA approved, is from -14 to +6, and astigmatism from -6 to +6. Femto-LASIK FS laser is an advanced technology, and it represents a major improvement in LASIK surgery. It offers versatile capability and flexibility in customizing the flap creation, and with program parameters, the FS performs exactly as programmed with precise, predictable outcomes. There is very little trauma to the eye and no patient discomfort. This is what a refractive suit looks like, where the patient is first placed below the femto laser, the flap is taken, and then the bed is swiveled to the laser machine, the EX500, so that the laser is applied. What if we cannot do LASIK for a patient? The cornea is too thin, The cornea is irregular, like keratoconus. We have intrastromal corneal implants, which are two semicircular rings made of PMMA. They are removable. The problem that they have is sometimes there is vision disorder and problems in night vision. What is gaining popularity today are the implantable phakic contact lens. The newer generations that we have are biocompatible, soft, flexible gel lens. And this is porcine collagen, which is polymerized with HEMA. Hence, it is called a Collamer. FDA has approved its use in myopia and myopic astigmatism right from the year 2005. The advantages of an IPCL procedure is it is reversible, unlike LASIK. The quality of vision is usually good. The astigmatism induced is minimum. The corneal tissue is not removed and hence the tear layer is adequate. The risk of optical distortions and higher order aberrations is very low. It is safe, effective, predictable, stable. ICLs and toric ICLs, that is in patients with astigmatism, are comparable to LASIK in all the measures of safety, efficacy, predictability, and stability. The complication rate is low and patients have good visual recovery. So we have a whole armamentarium of various types of treatment which can be done to get rid of the power in young individual. Every eye is unique and we need to select which procedure is suitable for which particular patient. Now we come to cataract surgery. Nowadays, our older generation people also would like to get their spectacles removed when they are, as it is, undergoing a surgery. So it is considered to be the most successful surgery in the world. So why do we want to mess around with it? And what is all the fuss about? What do we really want to achieve? I'm sure a lot of my senior colleagues here would be asking these questions when they find a patient who has been advised to do something like this. It is like killing two birds at the same time. Cataract surgery, we've come a long way today with no injections given, no stitch taken, there is no patch on the eye, no pain at all, no bleeding, and patients can resume their work very promptly. So in this type of a scenario, we have different sources of energy. We can do the ultrasound energy, which is what is generally used. Femtolaser helps us in accurate capsular access, incision, reduction in the phaco power and time, and numerous unique fragmentation patterns can be created. These are the state-of-the-art equipment which help us to remove all types of cataracts with the phacoemulsification machine. The days when we could not remove hard cataracts are almost gone. This is the microscopic view of the capsular access as done by the femto cataract laser, along with the grid pattern which is seen in the nucleus. Today, the patients expect uncorrected visual acuity, good quality of vision, immediate restoration of vision, and minimal or no dependence on spectacles. We have come a long way, right from couching to intracapsular cataract extraction, extracapsular cataract extraction, phacoemulsification, foldable lenses, then multifocal foldable lenses, toric multifocal IOLs to prelex, where we do an extraction and put in an implant for patients even without cataract if they're older than 50 and they have a high power. But for all this, we need to achieve reliable refractive outcomes in our cataract surgery. So what do? We guide the patient, we educate the patient. If you have astigmatism, if you put a normal monofocal lens, you will be wearing spectacles all the time. If you put a toric IOL, you will wear spectacles only for reading. And in case you put a multifocal toric lens, then you would be not having spectacles at all. If the patient has no cylindrical power, then if a monofocal lens is put, he needs glasses only for reading. If it's a multifocal lens, he does not need spectacles at all, or very rarely. This decision has to be shared with the patient. It is a decision taken together, depending upon their expectations and also their financial abilities. Once the patient has been selected, we need to see that there are conditions in the eye which are ruled out before we take them up for any planned advanced technology lens. So external examination for lid deformities, slit lamp examination for conditions like keratoconus, corneal opacities, fundus examination for macular disease. We need to rule out glaucoma and also need to rule out irregular astigmatisms which would not get corrected even with a toric intraocular lens. The IOL master is what we use for the lens power calculation. It gives us the keratometry, axial length, and these are the data which we need to put into all our calculators for the advanced technology lenses. The modern IOLs that we have today, aspheric, toric, multifocal, accommodative, special lenses in special situations, iris claw, aniridia IOLs, scleral fixated lenses, glued lenses, futuristic IOLs which are in the pipeline are adjustable lenses, telescopic lenses, and electronic lenses. Aspheric lenses are advanced monofocal lenses in the sense that the cornea has a positive spherical aberration and we need to put in a lens which does not add to it. Either it keeps it same or reduces it. So these are the spherical IOLs. This is what the vision is if you put in a normal standard monofocal lens. And if we put an aspheric IOL, this is what the patient sees. So the difference in the clarity of vision from here to here is pretty dramatic for the patient because the aberrations have not been aggravated by the lens. Night driving problems are also there in patients with standard monofocal lenses, and this is what they would see with the advanced technology lenses. Astigmatism, that is cylindrical power, this is what a healthy eye sees. And this is what the different types of astigmatism would see. The worst is with the oblique astigmatism. So we do need to help out the patient so that post-surgery they see better. The treatment options we have is positioning and enlarging the incision at the steep axis, limbal relaxing incisions which work pretty well up to 1 diopter cylinder, bioptics. Toric IOLs of course give the most predictable results. For that, the data which we've got from the IOL master is put in this calculator, and in the end what we get is the power of the lens which is to be inserted in that patient's eye. Since it is a toric lens, the preoperative marking is very important, and it is done on the slit lamp where if you, as you can see here, we mark the 180 degrees, we have marked the 90 degrees. We also have advanced equipment which can map it just by taking into consideration the blood vessels. We don't need to use a marker and the data gets transferred to the microscope directly. Accurate centration is critical in a toric lens because otherwise you may either not rectify the cylinder or you may aggravate and increase the cylinder. What do we do in presbyopia? We can either do monovision where the dominant eye is corrected for distance and the non-dominant eye is corrected for near. This is what we did before we had good multifocal lenses. Prelex is done in individuals where there is no significant cataract, but they are above 50 and they want to get rid of the high power that they are having. Multifocal IOLs are the most popular. Accommodating IOLs are also used. This is what a patient of multifocal IOL sees. He can see far, he can see intermediate, and also very near. This makes the patient less dependent or not at all dependent on their glasses for all distances. Who should we select? A hyperopic patient, patient having loss of accommodation, having cataract, or a unilateral traumatic cataract. Astigmatism can also be corrected with these multifocal lenses, and very high myopes. The ideal patient is someone in the 50s to mid-60s, having cataract which has started to compromise their quality of life, lead a very active lifestyle. They are very concerned about their appearance and quality of life and do not want to look old. They have realistic expectations, are very motivated, and they are hyperopes or high myopes. These are the ideal multifocal IOL patients. Who should we not do it in? This is very, very important because it's very difficult to satisfy a demanding patient. If they have significant dry eyes, if there is corneal scarring, if the first eye has a monofocal implant, if during surgery you find that the capsular support is unstable, or someone who is so demanding. The advanced multifocal lenses that we have today distribute light asymmetrically between distant and near. They are independent from pupil size. They have smooth microphase technology, and they are also correct the aberrations. Postoperative concerns which should be explained to the patient prior to surgery are glares and halos, internal reflections, anisometropia, that is difference in power of the two eyes till the other eye is done, and that the second eye needs to be managed to get complete vision. Also, they may have to be told they may have a drop in vision because of posterior capsular opacification, which can be rectified very easily. Accommodating IOLs are actually monofocal lenses, which change position inside the eye as the focusing muscle contracts, mimicking the eye's natural ability to focus. What do we do when we have an unhappy patient? We need to look for any residual cylinder and residual refractive errors. We need to look at the cornea for any pathology which has occurred or missed out, and dryness of eyes. We need to see the capsule to see whether there is any posterior capsular opacification, and then we have to peep in the retina and do a scan to see whether there is any macular edema. There are special situations where if we did not have special lenses, the patient would not be seeing so well. So we have iris claw lenses where if you can see the lens is clipped to the iris because there is no capsular support. We have aniridia lenses for patients who do not have any iris, and because of the glare of the huge area through which the light goes, our distorted vision, we can put them and create an artificial iris. Lenses can be glued in case there is a deficient posterior capsule, or they can be supported with sutures which are taken to the sclera to support the lens when there is a deficient posterior capsule. Telescopic lenses have started coming in. They give 25 times magnification. They are very useful in age-related macular degeneration, and they do not affect the peripheral vision. Uncorrected 6x6 vision begins with you, doctor, to see that the patient is done at the right place, counseling your patient regarding the various modalities available, keeping abreast with latest developments and seeing that the people around you are also up to date, identifying the patients who would benefit from this technology. We need to understand that cataract surgery should be now considered a refractive surgery. Why do we bother with co-management along with you? This enhances the patient satisfaction. There is a continuity in the care given. There are logistic concerns every time the patient cannot come to us and you are there to help them out. They have faith in you. In the end, they are your patients. And it builds a practice image for us and you both. Thank you for your kind attention, and I hope you had a nice nap.
Our next speaker is Dr. Haresh Asnani, who will be talking to us on diabetic retinopathy and the aging eye. Dr. Haresh Asnani is one of the earliest retina specialists of Mumbai and currently one of the busiest, practicing from Panvel to Dadar, from Ghatkopar to Sion, you name it, he goes there. And he'll be talking to us on diabetic retinopathy.
Very good afternoon to you all. Now we are going to shift gears and go into another part of the eye. That's the back of the eye. And I'm going to take you on a journey right from where you've been here before, the surface of the eye, the cornea, the lens, and now you're going into the retina. So I'm going to talk to you about two conditions, diabetes and age-related macular degeneration. This video is going to show you where the retina is. Retina is the layer at the back of the eye, and the center of the retina, for future reference, this is called as the macula. And this is responsible for fine vision. My first half of my lecture is on diabetic retinopathy. Now, as you know, diabetes is a silent killer, affecting almost all the systems in the human body and is a major contributor to diabetes-related morbidity. You can have, apart from retinopathy, you have nephropathy, neuropathy, stroke, cardiovascular disease, foot problems related to diabetes. The recent World Health Day highlighted diabetes in a very big way. And it's become a huge problem for all of us as doctors and as laymen. Some news or the other every day in the paper, in the media about diabetes. Currently, we have 422 million diabetics. That was measured in 2014. And the prevalence in India has more than doubled. We're seeing a high number of deaths due to diabetes at a young age, and risk factors like obesity, sedentary lifestyle are taking their toll. We are looking at a very, very large number of diabetics with eye problems in the next 10 years. At least 30 times more blindness that we saw compared to 10 years ago. It is slowly becoming a leading cause of blindness in India. And of course, we Indians have the unique distinction of being the leader in diabetes prevalence. With 25 million retinopathy patients currently under treatment in India, what are we doing about it? Now, diabetes not only causes retinopathy, we get cataract, we get refractive errors, we get third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerve palsies in diabetes. I'll talk only about retinopathy. As you know, just like it does in other organs like the kidney, the foot, diabetes affects the peripheral blood vessels. So it affects the blood vessels of the retina. And in the retina, it causes ischemia. Now, ischemia is the key word here. Ischemia means lack of blood supply, lack of oxygen supply. Ischemia is the culprit here, not high blood sugar, but it's ischemia. And retinal ischemia causes swelling of the retina, retinal edema. Then it leads to growth of new blood vessels from the retina, bleeding from those vessels, and then these vessels contract, causing retinal traction. These are different stages of retinopathy. I'll show you all the stages, starting from non-proliferative or background to proliferative and diabetic maculopathy stage. This is the earliest change that is seen in the retina. You see these dark blotch hemorrhages and the cotton wool spots or soft exudates. These are the ischemic retina. These fundus photos are of a little more advanced stage, but still non-proliferative background stage. And here you see these white spots. These are the hard exudates. This is also a non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy with hard exudates. And then it goes on to the next stage, that's proliferative. You can see these blood vessels which are growing on the optic disc, on the peripheral retina here. These are new vessels with this in the stage of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Sometimes even here the patient doesn't have any symptoms. And when patient develops a vitreous hemorrhage, the patient comes running to you. And this is a picture of vitreous hemorrhage. This vitreous hemorrhage can obscure the vision and bring the patient to your clinic. If untreated, it can go into a scarring stage and lead to a traction retinal detachment, where there is a pull on the retina from those blood vessels which contract, and it's very difficult to improve vision in these patients. Further traction on the retina can tear the retina and lead to what is called as a combined retinal detachment. And the late stage of fibrosis, where it is almost inoperable, looks something like this, and the optic disc also starts getting pale. The end stage of diabetic retinopathy is neovascular glaucoma, where you have blood vessels which grow from the retina surface right up to the front, onto the iris, and this causes a painful blind eye. Now, to avoid these complications, our focus should be more towards prevention of sight-threatening complications of diabetes. And for that, we have a few investigations which are useful here. We use angiography and OCT as screening tools for diabetic retinopathy, and let me show you how these work. First is this angiography. It's called fundus fluorescein angiography, or FFA. This is a special camera which is fitted with special filters to see the retina. We inject a fluorescent dye intravenously. It's an outpatient procedure, and this is what a normal angiogram of a retina looks like. In diabetic retinopathy, if you see a simple case with ischemia, all these red spots and white spots like exudates, it shows up area of non-perfusion. So the angiograph of a patient will look like this. This is what his retina looks like, and this is what the angiograph looks like. And you see these non-perfusion areas, or what we call as capillary dropout areas. The inferior retina here shows total non-perfusion, and you see these veins here, they are all sacculated, they are all congested. These are all signs of ischemia. So an angiography can pick up all these signs. Even if you don't see something clinically, you can see it on angiography. Angiography can show us leaking blood vessels on the surface of the retina here and here, leaking blood vessels on the optic disc, and can also pick up maculopathy. Now this looks bad, but it doesn't look so bad, but the angiography shows so much of leakage of dye in the macular area. This is a case of macular edema. The other test is called OCT. OCT stands for optical coherence tomography. Now this optical coherence tomography we've been doing for the last 15 years, and that has lent us a cutting edge to this management of all macular and retinal problems, especially with diabetic retinopathy. Now this is actually a structural imaging of the eye. It's a scan of the retina, and if you see the scan, OCT scan below, it shows us all the layers of the retina. So it's like actually a real-time in vivo cross-section of the retina with all the 9 layers of the retina seen. So this was a normal OCT, and this is what you see in diabetes. So very early subtle changes you can see here, some membranes on the retina. You can see little bit of swelling of the retina or increase in the thickness of the fovea, the central retina. Then you can pick up diabetic macular edema and traction on the retina. So this is a macular area with a little bit of traction. This is another what we call as a vitreomacular traction on the retina. So all these things cannot be detected clinically because these are all transparent structures, and on OCT we can actually pick them up at a very, very early stage. So our diabetic screening protocol consists of a proper eye exam, refraction, etc., and a dilated retina or fundus examination, and in diabetic patients, OCT, angiography, and not to forget a complete blood workup, HbA1c, lipid profile, etc. And when a patient has diabetic retinopathy, how do we treat these patients? So we have medical treatment, laser treatment, and surgical treatment. So we start with medical treatment of diabetic retinopathy. This is a multi-pronged approach. It's not just us treating the patient, but you all are involved here, controlling blood sugars, blood serum lipids, and controlling all their other morbidities like nephropathy, etc. And what we do is, on our part, we give some injections into the vitreous. Now these injections are given inside the eye in the vitreous, which go and act on the retina, and this reduces the vascularization, it reduces the edema. And these injections are called as anti-VEGF or even steroid injections. These injections are given in the operation theater with strict asepsis. It's just a 5-minute procedure. What is VEGF? I just said anti-VEGF. So what is VEGF? VEGF stands for vascular endothelial growth factor. Now this is a very important thing for normal angiogenesis. That means it's even found in the embryonic stage, in the placenta, in the newborn. It's responsible for normal blood vessel growth. It is responsible for wound healing. So this can also become abnormal. When it becomes abnormal, especially in patients with ischemia, like in diabetic retinopathy, you have what is called as VEGF upregulation. So the concentration of VEGF in the vitreous, in the retina, increases, and that leads to conditions like ischemic retinopathy, like diabetic retinopathy. It's also having a big role to play in AMD, that's age-related macular degeneration, which I'll elaborate a little later, and in growth of tumors. So VEGF has changed a lot of things, not only in our field, but even in chemotherapy field also. And as I told you, VEGF is necessary for normal wound healing, and there are a lot of different kinds of VEGFs. And VEGF-A is the important one, which is active in the eye. So we give these anti-VEGF drugs. I'm sorry, it's not very clear, but there are 3 drugs that we use here. Lucentis being the most popular one, Avastin and Eylea. Apart from that, we give steroids in the eye to reduce the swelling and bleeding from the retina. And Lucentis, or now it's called as Accentrix, made by Novartis, is the most popular drug here. This was the first FDA-approved drug, and it has changed the way we have been looking at retinal problems for the last 15 years. Significant decrease in these the incidence of diabetic macular edema, and fantastic response to these injections. The safety is very good because only 0.05 ml of the drug is injected in the eye, so no safety issues. There are other drugs also available like Avastin, which is also used in chemotherapy, and we have an off-label use here. The latest drug which is available now is called Eylea, which is recently introduced into the market. Apart from that, I told you we inject steroids in the eye, and we inject triamcinolone, which is regularly used, but this is a special triamcinolone which is prepared for intravitreal use. We also have this long-acting steroid called Ozurdex. This is a biodegradable intravitreal steroid implant. After the injection is given inside the eye, this implant dissolves and it releases dexamethasone into the vitreous over a period of 3 to 4 months. So, intravitreal injection is now the mainstay of the initial management of diabetic retinopathy, but you have to understand patient has to be counseled for long-term treatment. They require repeated injections, and in the long term they turn out pretty expensive, and this is done just to maintain their ocular status, just to maintain their macular or keep the edema under control. apart from injections, the most important treatment here is laser. This has been going on for the last 4 decades. Laser, well, I don't think is ever going to be replaced by anything else. You can keep on giving injections to the eye, but the permanent solution here and the most effective control is with lasers. First, we reduce the edema, we control the bleeding, and then you have to do laser for these patients. And so we have different kinds of lasers: green laser, diode laser, argon laser, yellow laser, many different lasers in the market. And what laser does is it ablates the retina. That means it converts this hypoxic retina, ischemic retina, to anoxic retina. So the VEGF which was being secreted stops getting secreted, and this is how it controls the diabetic retinopathy. This is a patient with a freshly lasered eye, freshly lasered retina, and this is laser marks seen about 6 months after the laser treatment. This is an angiography of that one patient who had macular edema and a lot of these leakages in the eye. And look at the patient's fluorescein angiography done 6 months after laser treatment. It looks so clean, and these are the laser marks which are seen around the macula. Now, some cases which don't respond to treatment, like non-absorbing or recurrent hemorrhages, traction on the retina, recurrent macular edema, you can do surgery for these patients. And the surgery is called vitrectomy surgery. Vitreous microsurgery or vitrectomy is the current trend in surgery. And as I can show you in this animation here, this is called as a 3-port vitrectomy. And 1 port is used for infusion, the second is used for illuminating the retina, and the 3rd port is used to introduce a cutter or a forceps or a scissor or a cautery or a suction instrument or a laser and perform surgery by removing the blood and doing all the kind of dissection that you want to. And visualization is from the pupil via special viewing systems. Now, with sutureless surgery, which has come into vogue right now, we use instruments which are 23 and 25 gauge. Procedure takes less than 1 hour from start to the end. And being sutureless, it's relatively painless in the post-op period and easy on the patient, just like cataract surgery. Of course, considering the nature of the pathology, the recovery period is much longer than cataract surgery. So fine instruments like these are used for dissecting membranes on the retina, and laser treatment can be also performed during surgery. As I told you, I'll show you a couple of short videos of this diabetic retinopathy surgery. Now, this is a video of a patient with a pre-retinal hemorrhage, and there's a thin layer which is on the, like a membrane on the surface, which I'm opening up. We've already made 3 openings to access the interior of the eye in the vitreous, and we are visualizing the retina under the microscope with special lenses and viewing systems. With this vitrectomy cutter, we remove the blood, and then there are some membranes which are coming from the retina. Those are peeled off. What I'm just doing now is something what we call as vacuum cleaning the retina. And then we do laser treatment, which will be shown even better in the next video, which was a case of a recurrent hemorrhage even after laser treatment. So I took this patient up for surgery, removed all the blood, the membranes, and after the retina is visualized properly, all the areas that could not be lasered properly are lasered using an endolaser. You can see the old laser marks also somewhere here, some dark marks here. So after laser is completed, then we put in air or oil inside the eye to support the retina, and then the patient is, the eye is closed. So the key points here in diabetic retinopathy are early diagnosis. This is, I don't know how much more I can stress on this, but this is probably the most important. Screening with OCT and angiography. And treatment-wise, it is intravitreal injections, laser treatment, and surgery in that order. So this is all about diabetic retinopathy. Let's take these concepts forward, help our diabetic patients preserve their sight, improve the quality of their life by prompt referrals to the retina clinics. I'm now going to go to the next condition, which is found in the elderly, called as age-related macular degeneration. This is something that affects the macula. Only the macula, the central part of the retina. This causes central visual loss and blindness. And AMD is the leading cause of severe and irreversible vision loss in patients over the age of 50. Earlier, we used to believe it's only a Western phenomenon, but now I think it's there all over the world. And as our population increases, the percentage of people above the age of 65 has gone up exponentially. And probably we'll see about 23% of our population in India being 65 plus after 2020. And with this, we will be seeing about 7.5 million patients of AMD. So how does AMD occur? Now this is a normal retina, and you see this is the retinal pigment epithelium, and there is a choriocapillaris layer here and the photoreceptors here. So this is like a barrier, nothing goes from here to here. And in AMD what happens is you get what is called as drusen. These are all yellowish spots on the surface of the retina, and drusen are actually thickening of this basement membrane of the RPE. And then this area is called as a drusen. Still nothing is happening. Patient may not have any symptoms. Now this drusen develops cracks, and then blood vessels start invading from the choriocapillaris into the retinal layers, right from here to here. And that's where you see these red spots on the retinal surface. Then these leak, and then scar formation, etc. happens, and then patients get distorted vision, and this is a full-blown case of AMD. The loss of central vision will have a severe effect on the quality of life, because patient cannot read, can't even tell the time, he cannot recognize a person. Looking at a person, he can't see his face. Problems while driving. They have good peripheral vision, but central vision is not good. Now, if patient's right eye is seeing this and the left eye is seeing this, probably he won't know that there is a problem, because may not be aware that there is a problem in the left eye, or may attribute this to a cataract being in a 65 plus age group. So the vision loss in AMD can be different types. Apart from what I showed you, this kind of a central scotoma, you can have decreased contrast sensitivity or metamorphopsia, that is distorted vision, or a generalized loss of vision. And we screen patients for AMD with the help of what is called as an Amsler chart or an Amsler grid. And all patients with high risk, they will see an Amsler grid, something like this, with a big scotoma in the center with a distorted grid line. Risk factors for this is primarily, most important proven risk factor is age, and second most proven risk factor is the family history of the genetic makeup of the patient. The other things are all relative and arguable risk factors like gender, light exposure, diet, and the race of the patient. Special investigation for AMD, again, it's OCT, which is the mainstay of our thing. OCT and angiography, which is what we use for diagnosing most of our retinal problems. I just showed you some OCTs of diabetic retinopathies, and this is how an OCT of a normal eye looks like, again. And this is what a OCT of an AMD patient looks like. On the right side is normal, and you see here this whole architecture of the retina is totally disrupted. All the layers, you cannot identify any layer properly because they're all invaded by blood vessels and fluid under the retina. We do angiography, again a normal angiography, just to refresh your knowledge. This is angiography in an AMD patient where you see this leaking dye right in the center of the retina, and dye is even spreading to the temporal part of the retina in this case. Now, AMD again is of two types, dry and wet. 80% of AMDs are dry. Now, dry suggests that nothing much happens there. These are slowly progressive things. They don't really, only 20% of vision loss in AMD is caused by dry. But wet AMD, which affects only 20% patients, causes 80%, 90% vision loss due to AMD. So what we treat more aggressively are the wet AMDs. The dry AMDs, we don't do much about it. We just counsel them, we follow them up regularly, and we give them some kind of vitamin supplements, nutritional supplements, etc. And what we give them more is vitamin A, C, E, those antioxidants which you all know about, green leafy vegetables, and good amount of zinc in the diet. People who eat non-vegetarian, a lot of seafood with omega-3 fatty acids, and some kind of lifestyle modification which we advise them on. Wet AMD treatment is again just like diabetic retinopathy. It's laser and injections. Surgery is not really pursued nowadays. Surgery results have never been good in AMD because you're dealing with the central retina, which is already scarred, and you don't really get good results in surgeries. So what we do is laser and injection. In laser, we have this special kind of laser treatment called photodynamic laser. Now we are dealing with the central retina. If we laser the central retina with the regular laser I showed you for diabetic, you're going to destroy the central retina totally. So patient will not be able to see. In fact, his vision will get worse. So you do this PDT laser, photodynamic, it's a selective laser. It will destroy only the membrane, only the neovascular membrane. It will spare the remaining retina. So this is a special dye that is given intravenously. It's called Visudyne. Vertiporphin is the generic name. It is a photosensitizer dye, and it goes into the bloodstream and goes and attaches itself to the endothelium of the neovascular membrane. And then this dye is activated by this special laser, which destroys that neovascular membrane selectively, sparing the sensitive layers and the photoreceptors of the retina. So the patient's vision is actually maintained by doing this photodynamic therapy. The other thing I told you, now you're all familiar what is VEGF. I will not go into the details. Again, Lucentis or Accentrix is the most popular injection for AMD. And the other drugs are also used in the same way. But in AMD, we stress that the patient takes a course of 3 injections at monthly intervals. And then additional injections are given if you need to maintain the results or try to improve the results. And do they work? I don't have to read all this. I just say 2 words. Yes, they work very well. And the patients are actually able to read, they write their checks, even do crossword puzzles. They can, do some stitching, etc. Unfortunately, AMD, the public awareness is very low. And very few people are familiar. When you tell them what is AMD, they don't understand. They have to be actually told and shown pictures of AMD, what it actually looks like, and what exactly can happen. It's not complete blindness, but it's a loss of ability to read, write a check, do very important things. At the age of 65, there are very few things that you can do. Most people may not even drive, but they would want to see something in their checkbook, their bank balance. So it's very important. And to increase the awareness of AMD, we are trying to spread this message. Detection of AMD is very, very important here. As I said, the fellow eye may be good, so it may compensate for the vision loss, and patient may think it's a cataract or a part of the aging process. Patient education will improve detection, and regular eye examination is the best way to go. We also have genetic testing here, which is now coming up in a big way, just like genetics is coming into other fields. And to just summarize treatment, like laser, anti-VEGF injections, vitamin supplements, antioxidants, and genetic testings is the way to go to treat AMD. Thank you so much for a patient listening in the postprandial period. Thank you. Any questions? Sorry? At GP level, you can ask the patient about what kind of a visual loss you have. In a cataract, you'll have a generalized dimness, dullness of vision, but in AMD, you will find central scotoma. You will find metamorphopsia. The letters and the lines appear crooked. You can show an arithmetic book to your patient and say these lines are there, cross lines. You can see that and you can tell whether those lines are crooked or not. It's very simple to diagnose metamorphopsia and central scotoma in the clinic. So you can have some kind of a judgment and say that, yeah, maybe the patient has AMD.
Patients who are having this floaters and all due to vitreous degeneration, what can be done in such cases?
Question is about vitreous floaters. Now, vitreous floaters comes in a lot of conditions. One is vitreous degeneration, as you said. You can have simple vitreous degeneration that is called as a posterior vitreous detachment, which everyone will get after a certain age. There, the vitreous is just getting liquefied and degenerated, and some of the debris that is floating around in the vitreous is seen by the patient. That is harmless. Then you have vitreous degeneration due to in patients of high myopia and patients with retinal degeneration. That is more dangerous, and those kind of patients have to be referred. Now, you will not be able to tell whether it's due to just a simple age-related posterior vitreous degeneration or it's due to a myopic. So you have to refer the patient for a retina examination. And the third cause that I just showed you is a vitreous hemorrhage in diabetic retinopathy patients. Sorry? Treatment. Treatment, as I said, for dry eye, there's no definite treatment. We focus more on nutritional supplements, trying to correct their vision with low vision aids, or as Dr. Neeta Shah showed us about these special lenses that can be put for these macular degeneration patients. And What we have started now is genetic testing to see that at least their siblings, their children, which they have a very high risk of developing macular degeneration, they are counseled in those manners. So there's no active treatment in terms of injections or anything for that. Sorry? Genetic testing has now become very cheap. I do my genetic testing with a company which sends mucosal scrapings abroad, and the cost to a patient is just about 15,000, which is actually the cost of one injection. So this is a very painless, simple test. You scrape the inside of the mucosa and the buccal mucosa and send it, and you get a report in about a month's time, which gives the patient a 10-year risk of developing an AMD. Also suggests that what kind of antioxidants are going to be useful to this patient. So the cost is pretty good now. I mean, there was a time where similar test would cost us about 60,000-70,000 rupees. And we had to send it to Hyderabad for that, but now the cost is coming down.
Question to Dr. Nitesh. I have a patient that's having cataract and astigmatism. The IOL toric would be more helpful in such patients.
Yes,
And how
toric.
much would be the cost for that?
The toric intraocular lens, if we do a monofocal toric intraocular lens, we charge around 50,000. In case of a multifocal, it is around 90,000. But if the lens power is odd, means below 15 diopters, or cylinder more than 4, the lenses are made in Germany and come, and then the company, we need to charge the patient around 1.25 lakhs for the surgery. But if there is a patient who is not very affording, and they need a toric implant, and a monofocal toric implant, what we can do is a limbal relaxing incision, which we do with diamond knives, whereby we at least bring the cylinder down to somewhere around 0.5. So that works definitely for monofocal vision, but it will not work for a multifocal lens implant, but it would definitely better than not doing anything if they can't afford that 50,000 too. Any more questions? Otherwise, we have tea, coffee, just to wake up everybody. I hope you all had a good time. Thank you so much for coming. I would also like to thank Dr. Haresh Asnani, Dr. Neeta Shanbag, who has left, Dr. Akshay, and my whole team from Ayush Eye Clinic. And above all you doctors for sparing the time to come to listen to us here. Thank you so much.